Let me wish everyone a very happy Madras Day. Sriram, over to you.
Thank you, Madras Chamber of Commerce and Industry, for inviting me to speak on a topic that I love. Saraswati, as usual, it's very interesting that a Chamber of Commerce should have a secretary called Saraswati. But Saraswati is a very tough, person to break. So she called me and said, we want you to come and speak. And I said, what is this, Saraswati? I've spoken enough number of times with the chamber. There's nothing new. I've done all this and I'm repeating myself. Whereupon, she sent me 8 topic titles by WhatsApp. Now, after that, I couldn't say anything. So I said, okay, I like this topic. I said, why don't you give the talk yourself, since you seem to have thought it all through? And she said, no, you do it. So then I decided to work on it and put it together. And I enjoyed working on it. Thank you very much for giving me this topic, because I hadn't thought of it earlier, and it really set me thinking. And it was a very interesting experience putting it together. Now, the English could have never worked in isolation, because they just didn't know anything. In fact, most recently I've been reading about how even after arriving here, Dave was completely at a loss on whom to transact with, how he was going to get land for starting up a fort or a factory, etc. It was the Indians who were really helping him at every stage, and there was a set of translators who were the Dvibhashis, who were helping him, whom we know as Dubashis. And most recently I've been reading about a man called Raghava Bhattan, who apparently in 1638 had begun the transactions with the English 1 year before they were going to come here. They were in Machilipatnam. He had gone there, he had met them, then he was going and meeting the Nayaks of Poonamalli and Vandavasi, as Ramkumar was saying. And the official history of Madras, vestiges of old Madras, records that Raghava Bhattan laid the foundation stone for Fort St. George when it was executed in 1639. So that was the level of involvement with the Indians. And just behind Fort St. George came the Black Town. This is where the Indians were all living, and they were not only Dubashas. Dubashas were, of course, the most visible and the most prosperous element, because, as I keep saying, neither party knew the language of the other party. So the translator was making all the money in between. So they became multimillionaires. It was a very nice profession to be in at that time. But there were plenty of other people. There were goldsmiths. There were people who had to verify the quality of the gold that was coming in. There were people who were operating the mint. There were people who were taking care of daily supplies to Fort St. George, including the supply of water. So Black Town was really where everything was going on in order to keep White Town going ahead. It was the back-end operations, if you so to speak. And till today, Chennai is a back-end operation capital. It hasn't changed all that much if you look at it. So then all the back-end operations were taking place in Black Town, including the flesh trade, because this was a bachelor's establishment, White Town. So the flesh trade also had to flourish, and that too was happening over there. So initially, Black Town and White Town, and this Black Town is an aquatint in the Chambers collection, as is the earlier one of the fort. But this doesn't present you the real picture of what Black Town was like, because it looks very organized and very empty and vast open spaces, etc., etc. Now, by the beginnings of the 18th century, around 80 years after the English had come, at that time, Fort and Black Town were the two commercial hotspots, and there was really nothing else. For the first time, the English realized that, we go and pay money to weavers in villages who then take the money and vanish, and they don't supply the cloth. Why don't we do one thing? We get the weavers to come and settle in the shadow of Fort St. George itself. So they create 2 villages. The first village is a place that we today know as Kaladipete, originally known as Collettpet, named after Joseph Collett, who was the governor of Madras in the early 18th century. It is just next to Tiruvottriyur. The second one is Chinna Taripete, which is Chindadripet today, and that is where it's the second village of weavers. So even today, but you must remember that these were just not the two villages. These are the two company-created villages, but there were lots of other places wherever you find street names like Jandra Pillayar Kovil Street, Jandravar Street, Kaikolar Street. These are all places where we know that weavers at one time existed, and they were all supplying cloth to Fort St. George. These two were recognized, but the others were informal settlements that must have sprung up all around this place. So weaving must have been the equivalent of the IT business in those days. They had a ready customer who was exporting it, money was coming in, and they were settling at various places around Madras. And so this is today's Chindadripet that I have put up over here. It is not very different from this photograph of Blacktown that you see in the Chamber of Commerce's 1936 picture. The same quality of narrow streets, vertical buildings, plenty of people on the road, and the business model of all these old commercial localities of Madras was essentially that the ground floor was meant for commerce, the first floor was meant for residence. This is how they lived. So it was a mixed zoning system that, so the area never went dead at night or during weekends. See, today we have a major problem when you look at commercial spaces where crime becomes a major issue, particularly crime of various kinds during weekends or after office hours when it becomes deserted. So in a place like this with people living above and offices below, there was life going on all the time in these areas. So it was a business model that somehow we seem to have lost sight of over a period of time, because as these areas became increasingly congested and as motor vehicles began coming in, the people began to leave these areas. And prosperity also, at one time, the richest people of Madras lived in these localities. But today, later, by the 1970s, it became a situation where they were living in Keelpok, Poes Gardens, Boat Club Road, but they had their offices in these areas. Over a period of time, they abandoned the offices as well, and then they converted them, unfortunately, into retail establishments with commercial vehicles going there for delivery and coming back, and that completely destroyed the fabric of what I would call old Blacktown. But this was essentially an area where mixed zoning is what was considered. Now, this was essentially the situation till 1801. In 1801, the East India Company took a landmark decision that Fort St. George would no longer have any commercial establishments. Till then, all the British business houses, those involved in private trade, and the independent companies outside of East India Company, like Parry and Company, they were all located, Lice, Latour and De Monte, these were all some of the companies, they were all located inside Fort St. George. So in 1801, the governor of Madras at that time, Edward II Lord Clive, he was the master of decongesting. In fact, he wanted to leave Fort St. George himself and build a house for himself at the corner of Mount Road, which is where today you have the Omandurar government estate. So he decided that the business houses will have to leave from Fort and go and settle somewhere else. So in 1801, the first business house to leave Fort St. George was Parry and Company. And Parry would select a piece of land that was to the north of Fort St. George, immediately to the north of Fort St. George, separated by a vast piece of greenery that was known as the Esplanade. That was a security measure, so that there was a clear line of fire from the fort to any enemy who was approaching. Beyond that, there was nothing till you came to the village of Royapuram, which was around 2 kilometers away. And the sea today has receded considerably because the harbour has come in. But at that time, it was practically lapping the walls of Parry and Company. It was somewhere here. The sea was here when Parry was initially built his company. And so this area became Parry's Corner. And thereafter, for almost from 1803 till 2024, we still refer to it as Parry's Corner. enormous branding for one commercial entity that is still surviving and flourishing thanks to the Murugappa group. Now, when Parry had established his offices here, the governor helped everything a little further by shifting the harbour also, or the place where the ships came and stopped, from the front of Fort St. George to this particular locality. So all the business houses began to come up on that road leading to Royapuram, and that became First Line Beach. Today we recognize it as Rajaji Saleh. And First Line Beach is where all the British business houses came to have their offices. Best & Company, Gordon Woodruff, Beardsell, Parry of course was there. Their pet newspaper, the Mail, was there. The Mercantile Bank, the Bank of Madras. And when they wanted railway lines to be laid, they dictated where the terminus should be. So it was at the northern end at Royapuram. When they wanted the post office, they dictated where the post office should be. It was right in the middle of that road. So everything came up on that particular side. Now they called themselves the industrialists of Madras because they were not into retail trade. They were processing sugar, they were making alcohol, they were into leather and things. They were doing a significant amount of import and export, but they were into wholesale. And then there was a retailing side. They looked down on the retail element. So these were the members of the Madras Chamber of Commerce. And on Mount Road, you had the members of the Madras Trades Association. So companies like Spencer's, Simpson's, Addison's, Higginbotham's, these were all companies that would come up on Mount Road. They were all members of the Madras Trades Association. And the MCC and the MTA detested each other most cordially. So every once in a while they would meet up, but each would badmouth the other, and you can see any number of it in the MCC's minutes itself, all the time attacking the Madras Trades Association as a set of inferior beings. So the Mount Road would therefore begin to, again this is a picture from the Chamber of Commerce's centenary volume, and Mount Road would develop as a retail hub. So this is where you not only had all the commercial retail establishments, this is where you got all the hotels, this is where you had the entertainment houses, this is where music houses and theatre houses eventually morphed into cinema theatres. And many of us will, I think all of us will remember a time till 1980s or so, when Mount Road was the home of cinema. We had practically 30 or 40 theatres on that one road, and you could go there. If you didn't get ticket in one, you could go into the other, you could keep trying till you reach the other end of Mount Road. So this was where all the retail establishments were coming up. Now, where were the Indians in all this? The Indians were continuing to operate from Blacktown, and they were the final last mile connect with the consuming public, because they would get the imported goods from all these companies, and then they would have their small retail outlets at various places along China Bazaar Road, Rattan Bazaar Road, and all those places in Georgetown. One major revolution that came about in the 1840s was when the government began permitting Indians to print in their own languages. And Mint Street, which had earlier been the place where all the jewellery establishments and all the gold and everything was being processed, this became the home of printing. Every second building virtually on Mint Street was a printing press. And if you look at much of modern Madras's or Chennai's media history, you will find all of them had their origins on Mint Street or in a street next to it. Mukar Nalamuthu Street, Mint Street, Govindapanayakan Street. So Hindu came from here, Ananda Vigadan came from here, Indian Express came from here, the Mail came from here, the Spectator came from here, the Madras Courier came from here. Every one of them started their printing activity on Mint Street. And so that would eventually lead to a dissemination of thought, of people thinking about freedom, independence, and so on and so forth. So this was a very important location. But North Madras was really where the major industries would come up. And for that, the simple reason was the establishment of the railways in 1856, 1857, and then here in 1863 in South India. The railways, the Madras and Southern Maratha Railway Company, or at that time the Madras Railway Company, it needed workshops to take care of its rolling stock and other machining equipment that it needed for servicing. So they selected Perambur in 1857 to be the place where they would have their workshops. Again, Chamber of Commerce photograph of the Perambur workshops in 1936. And this is where a lot of the heavy machinery for the first time would arrive. You must remember at that time there was no harbor. Everything was offloaded on catamarans and rowed to the shore and then brought here on bullock carts and then grouted. So it's a tremendous amount of effort that was done to bring the machinery. So the Perambur and the railway workshops there, they would really begin to industrialize the northern part of the city. Shortly after Perambur came the Buckingham and Carnatic mills in the 1860s. The first the Buckingham mills and then the Carnatic mills. And at one time in the 1920s, BNC was employing 25,000 people between Madras and Bangalore. When the city had a population of 3.99 lakhs, if 25,000 people were employed in one industrial entity in various capacities, either directly or indirectly, it meant that virtually 1/3 of the city's population was dependent on Binni. That was the size of the Buckingham and Carnatic mills. And so this led to further industrialization of the north. You had the Western India Match Company coming up, Wimco, in 1920s. And thereafter, the north would be the industrial side. The south would be beginning to develop as the residential side. Now in 1906, the Madras Chamber of Commerce was very maladroit and it supported a company called Arbuthnot and Company, which failed and went bust. And everybody, including the Madras Chamber and its newspaper, they supported Arbuthnot and Company, much to the distress of the Indians who had been affected. That led to Indians beginning to realize that they needn't be just clerks and they could get on with businesses of their own. Many of them began to enter banking, stock market, broking and other things. And in retaliation to First Line Beach being the place where all the British business houses were located, at right angle to it and moving from east to west, because this was going from south to north, moving from east to west, all the Indian finance houses and business establishments would start coming up as though rivaling the British establishments on First Line Beach. And to help them, the Madras Christian College in the 1930s sold all its properties here and moved to Tambaram and Chetpet with its school and college. They purchased all these buildings wholesale, and this is where you found the Madras State Cooperative Bank, the United India Insurance, and several other buildings that came up. On this side, the Madras Stock Exchange was located just behind on Second Line Beach. So many other companies came up on this side. And their Chamber of Commerce, because Madras Chamber of Commerce for the British companies, so the South India Chamber of Commerce for these people was also located over here. And once again, like the Madras Trades Association, heavy ill will and hatred between the bodies. Leather was at Pyramid. You know, it's very interesting that in the 1750s when they built a town wall around Madras, the place where the central station is located today was a village of Chaklis. Chaklis are traditionally the community that operates on leather. And that area was known as Chaklipalayam, and the fort gate that opened out from there was known as the Chaklas Gate. Now, that area eventually would become the birthplace of the leather industry, of which today Tamil Nadu is the largest exporter, I think, as far as I remember, in India. And so Pyramid would become the place where all the leather establishments would come up. And one of the major companies at that time that was into leather was Gordon Woodruff. Later, when pollution began to raise its head and smell, etc., became an issue, they began to shift out. And they didn't go north. The leather companies began to move south. So Pallavaram became a major base for them, and so did Krompet, where there was the Chrome Leather Company, which was also a pillar of the Madras Chamber of Commerce, and they had finalized, or they had fine-tuned the chrome method of tanning, and so they called themselves the Chrome Leather Company, and that area became Krompet. So there was a time, I don't know, many of you will remember, when we went there, we could smell that we were approaching Pammal or Pallavaram or Krompet. Today those smells have all vanished, but that is how it was. So this was the scenario broadly till the Second World War. At the beginning of the Second World War, we were a city with a population of around 400,000 people. Our industrial establishments were essentially in the north with very few establishments in the south. The Second World War would change the entire complexion of our city, because we were the one city that was not bombarded during the Second World War on the Eastern Command. And therefore, every item and every soldier had to be pushed through Madras Harbour to various places. And so this became the population of the city doubled. It became 8 lakhs from 4 lakhs at the end of the Second World War. And that is when the government began to realize that there was a lot of potential in this city that it had practically forgotten, but was chugging along on its own steam for this long. So they decided that they could establish a lot of the defense industries over here. They began to take over land. They began to acquire a lot of land on the western face of the city, as far away from the sea as possible. So that is where, for instance, they thought that they could have all their army bases. The Air Force base came up in Tambaram for the first time. And therefore, this would become the center where ancillary industries would slowly begin to, west and south were now going to gradually develop. But before that, there was one major explosion in the northern side of the city, which was in 1949, the establishment of amalgamations by Anantaramakrishnan. With that, the future of Madras as an automotive hub was more or less assured. And this was the biggest industrial estate, private industrial estate of its time, one place where there were as many as 18 or 19 individual companies manufacturing everything from tractors to engine blocks to paints to blocks to all kinds of things. They were all here in this place. And so that would further transform the image of the northern part of the city. So you had Perambur, you had Binni, you had amalgamations, and so the north would be like that. In the south, you had Standard Motors. So this was we were one of the 3 cities of India that were making vehicles, because we had a harbour. So Calcutta was having Hindustan Motors, Bombay and Pune together would have Fiat, or Premier, as it was called, Premier Automobiles at that time, and we had Standard Motors over here. Forget the numbers that we were making. But even one of the earliest, by the way, this advertisement, I removed the second part of it because it says, we regret our factory is closed due to a lockout. We promise that we will open soon, etc. It didn't look very edifying, so I cut all that out and just put this bit. So that was the way we were. But we were making automobiles in the southern part of the city, and therefore, in future, the south would begin to develop. Once again, moving to the west at this time, just after the Second World War, the Murugappa group would define what we today know as Avadi and Ambattur. I mentioned to you that the British had acquired a lot of land over there to house the army on the western side. Post the Second World War, all that land was becoming empty. The Malaysian refugees were also being housed over there. And once those refugees were leaving, they had been rehabilitated, all that land was coming up for sale. The Murugappas brought practically a large parcel of it, and then they began to set up their base over there, thereby transforming Avadi and Ambattur and then Dunlop would come later, and transforming that into a major establishment for industrial development. At around the same time, heavy vehicles were being made in Ennore, with Ashok Leyland having been set up over there. Murugappas would also follow suit, KCP would follow suit with Tiruvottriyur and Ennore becoming another establishment. Then in the 1960s, you had the TVS group coming in here, beginning with 1961, with Wheels India, Brakes India, Sundaram Clayton and Lucas TVS. 4 companies being set up on what was called Padi, is still called Padi, but just at the corner of Ambattur. And that, with amalgamations, with Standard Motors, with Ashok Leyland, with TVS, we were on a trajectory of becoming an automotive capital, which post-liberalization, I don't have to elaborate, and we've just become bigger and bigger on this. In the 1950s, we had a government that was very seriously looking at industrial development, and in 1958, with Guindy, with Standard Motors being located to the south, Guindy was considered to be a good place to begin developing industrial estates. And the first industrial estate of South India would come up in Guindy in 1958. And that is how small medium entrepreneurs were given land over there, because the north was considered to be, today's definition of overpopulated and their definition of overpopulated is very different. But they felt that the north has been fully exploited and you can't do anything more over there, the infrastructure cannot stand it. So let's move to the south. And that is where land was also available. Today, can you imagine, they thought land in Guindy was much cheaper than land in Thiruvattriyur or Ennur or Avadi or Ambattur. And they decided that they would develop the first industrial estate there. 1958, Guindy begins to develop, and Guindy really marks the continuous shift of industrialization to the south from the north. The west and the south thereafter would become the places of business establishments. So you had the Ambattur Industrial Estate inaugurated a couple of years after the Guindy Industrial Estate. And then we moved south, where we had the Vikram Sarabhai Industrial Estate coming up for electronics. And slowly, establishments of units like the Central Leather Research Institute, the what is called the Central Polytechnic campus today, with all its multiple trade-related entities, all of them coming up on the southern fringe of the city. Gradually, they would develop. But these were all essentially government-sponsored initiatives. I would consider the Sanmar Group's move to Karapakkam to be one of the first major moves in the southern direction, especially the establishment of industries by private initiative. There are photographs, I think, in the Sanmar collection of land before their units came up over there and then after. So you can see nothing in the initial photographs, and then gradually you find entities coming up. So with this push, eventually we would get the Maraimala Nagar industrial estate, which would really mark the southern end of the industrial development of our city, after which it really goes off in other directions. Finally, we come towards the end of the presentation. By the 1990s, with liberalization having come in, and Ford and Hyundai and all of them setting up base on the southern side, you had the automotive revolution taking off in a big way. You also had the IT revolution coming up, and that is when we got the Tidal Park established on OMR, and after that, that entire area became taken over by a breed of people who have a separate standard of living, a separate language that they speak, of which the rest of the city doesn't seem to know anything. As long as they know that they are happy, we are happy, everybody is fine. So that's one ghetto, we are in another ghetto. We are a museum to them, they are a showpiece to us. And somewhere in between, the city has been muddling along and is continuing to grow. So this is essentially the broad development of the city as such, as a organized sector development. There is just one element that I did not bring in because I wanted to leave it as a hazy element, and which is the cinema industry, for which we are so well known. The cinema industry is the city of dreams, is the stuff of dreams, and it is officially not recognized as an industry. It's always spoken of as an industry only during election times. Otherwise, it's never spoken of. You just read the newspapers, you will come across this. Nobody will talk about cinema as an industry unless there is an election in the offing. So the cinema industry would also contribute to the development to the western side of the city with Kodambakkam. Now, the reason why Kodambakkam? Again, because of the Second World War. During the Second World War, as I said, there were all these land pockets that the government had taken over. Now, when you needed to station troops in all those places, you needed electric supply as well. So a powerhouse was established in Kodambakkam so that power could be supplied to all these air force bases, these service industries, these defense establishments. When they were leaving, the power supply was surplus. So the land was available in plenty with an outstanding source of power for uninterrupted shooting. And that is how, and Gemini was already there for 30 years or 15 years at the entrance of Kodambakkam. So towards the end of Kodambakkam, all the studios began to come up, Vijaya and Vahini, AVM, Prasad, and so many others. And that entire T Nagar Kodambakkam belt would get populated by cinema aspirants, people who were providing services to the world of cinema. And if you do a survey of the city, and I strongly believe that Madras is not a Tamil city, it's a multilingual city, you'll find that the maximum multilingual element is on that Kodambakkam stretch. You'll find temples for Bengalis, you'll find the Sikhs over there, you'll find there was a pocket of Anglo-Indians at one time. You'll find all of them had once lived on that particular stretch because they were all catering to the film industry. Now, of course, film industry is not located in Kodambakkam any longer, though we keep talking about it as Kollywood. But that again is a story that I think needs its own documentation at some time. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks a lot.